Hello, my name is Randy Vandervlag. Today I'll be talking about Fighting Fantasy, the Warlock of Firetop Mountain for Nintendo DS, specifically the art direction of the project. Now, if you're like me, you know nothing about Fighting Fantasy, except for this DS title. Let me bring you up to speed. In the early 1980s, created by Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson. It was a choose-your-own-adventure style book with a Dungeons & Dragons twist. Before you started reading the book, you had to build your character stats, like skill, stamina, and luck, with the roll of the dice. But if you didn't have any dice, you could just use the random dice rolls found at the bottom of every page. As you read your adventure, you could change the outcome based on what pages you did or didn't go to, sometimes with unfortunate results. And, just like in today's role-playing games, you'd also encounter monsters to fight, items to find, and other characters to talk to. I think these Fighting Fantasy books can easily be called the first portable RPG. The formula proved popular enough to spawn over 60 titles in the series. Oops, forgot a slide, sorry. A bestiary, an encyclopedia of the Fighting Fantasy world, its own magazine, several Commodore 64 games, and even more books to expand this ever-growing library. Jump ahead 27 years to 2009, Big Blue Bubble, and the Fighting Fantasy team try to recapture the adventure magic that made the book so popular.
Yay!
Now, when I was brought on as lead artist, I began to think about what I wanted Fighting Fantasy to be. How did I want this game to look? And I could only ever come up with one answer: epic. I didn't want people to say, that looks great for a DS, because to me that's not a compliment. Fighting Fantasy either looks good or it doesn't. And the second answer isn't an option. So we buckled down, stayed focused, and set our quality bar high. I made sure that everyone knew what they had to do, and I made sure the artist tasks played to their strengths, because a happy artist is a good artist.
Yeah!
Oh, Bob, we miss you.
May he rest in peace.
I made communication the key between the art team and myself, and between me, programmers, designers, and producers. Trust was also a factor, because if I can't trust my artists, or the higher-ups can't trust me, my decisions, then there's going to be problems. But I'll go over all that later. First, I want to cover what our art team had to do when it came to creating our monsters, rooms, weapons, and all the things that we learned as we went along. So as things got going, I started to keep my eyes open and study other games that matched ours, or ones that had great points to them, because I believe in keeping a close eye on the competition. I took a peek at Metroid Hunters, and was quite impressed at its environments. Its setting didn't match ours, but seeing that the DS was capable of pulling off some impressive visuals for a first-person shooter game set a great base to start from. I also tried some Brothers in Arms for Nintendo DS, and again was very impressed with what I saw. I liked the realistic objects and locations, as well as the believability that the game had, which was something I wanted to achieve. Dimension 4 was probably our closest competition to first-person adventure. I found the visuals not as sharp as Metroid Hunters and Brothers in Arms, but it made up for that in its moody atmosphere and its great characters. Finally, during one of my searches, I came across a Japanese RPG game called Riz Zapland, and I was struck back at how gorgeous it was. And even though it was an RPG rather than a first-person adventure, it was a title I always kept in the back of my head. These were only a few of the games that I followed or played. Orcs and Elves, Moon, Mazes of Fate, and Darkspire. All of these titles helped me round out the final idea of what I wanted Fighting Fantasy to be. So at this point, I knew what I wanted to achieve. I wanted a rich, detailed world, and I needed each area and room to be a believable area to the player. I needed now to convey my ideas to my team. So obviously, room concepts were painted to help establish room moods, color palettes, and so forth. But we also found that floor plans helped tremendously with the world plan. It was on these plans that we marked off the light sources, points of interest for the player, and other key game elements we had to keep track of. Pretty basic stuff at this point. I would then go and sit down with the 3D artist and go over the room design. It was at this point that I was able to properly convey my ideas. I found that nothing works better than being face-to-face with the artist. We would go over what I called room history. See, we're making a world that doesn't exist. But to the inhabitants of Fighting Fantasy, this world has always been, and it was absolutely key that we showed it. I told my artist to think about the room before they built it, before the players saw it. What happens here? What would have happened here? If something was placed or left in the room, how would you leave it? Think about logic when placing objects, and the room will become that much more believable. I told them that the rooms and environments are just as much characters in this game as the enemies, and should be treated as such. The other thing that we had to remember that this game takes place in a mountain like 95% of the time. So we had to really be creative and not fall into the trap of being hallway after hallway after hallway. How did we avoid that? Well, one was to create areas that the player could see but not get to. I remember this brought up debates as if this would frustrate the player because they would get sidetracked or try looking for a way to get to something they could never reach. I had the opinion that it was not only fine but needed in our game, as it made the world seem larger in such a confined space. I've seen this technique used in other titles, and I really like it. It made me feel that the world was larger, older, and more complex than I might think, even though I might never reach those areas. Besides, the world I live in isn't a box. I can see places in my daily life where I'm not allowed to go. Why shouldn't our game reflect that? So, holes that looked into open maws, bridges that showed other lights and bridges, holes in the ceiling where the light could shine through, and my favorite, fissures within the mountain that the player would have to cross with no glimpses of ceiling or floor. Another aspect we could play with was lights. Now that's not something you hear too much about on DS, so we use that to our advantage to make the player a dynamic light source. This gave us a new aspect to play with when creating our rooms. The player could now light up the dark areas and have a greater sense of exploration, on top of adding a new layer of atmosphere to our world. It was during this time of development that I was playing Shadow of the Colossus, and I was in awe of the beauty and grandeur that it had in its world, and I knew it was something I wanted to try and capture in our title. And so I made it the personal project, or I made it my personal goal of the project. So the 3D artists with all this knowledge went forth and pushed the polys, all 2,000 of them. That's right, we were only allowed 2,000 polys per room, and trust me, you'll run out fast, especially when you have to cut the lights and shadows into your scene. How many 3D artists can say that they've had to do that? Because these days, low poly modeling doesn't even come close to what we required for our rooms, and the learning curve was steep. On top of learning how to cut the lights and shadows, they had to become hypercritical as to where to show key detail work, where to cut polys in order to get that feeling that I discussed with them. All in 2,000 polys or less. Oh, and only 128K of texture space per room, a week to do it all in. But they pulled off some amazing rooms. The monsters of fighting fantasy were equally a challenge. During my stakeout of other games, I never once saw monsters or NPCs being done the way we were doing them. Sure, I saw 2D enemies, but they were typically low-res, quite pixelated, and had little to no animation. We, on the other hand, were making fully illustrated paintings and animating those. We initially painted them at least twice the size, about 512 by 512 pixels, and then shrunk them down to 256 by 256 and prepped them for the game. Keeping them at this resolution allowed us to have beautifully painted enemies with no scaling or pixelation issues. But as I mentioned before, these enemies were basically animated illustrations, and so the time it took to make them was huge. Basic actions were picked in order to save on time, and fluff actions were put on wish lists. The walk cycle alone took on average 2 weeks from beginning to end. How did we even pull something like that together? Well, I'll show you. This here is our dwarf. In his finished form, prepped for the game, he looks quite nice, but underneath, he's actually built from numerous pieces. These elements like legs, vests, feet, beard, hammer, were all individually animated